Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. Ever had a neighbor who was a little too friendly? Try an entire neighborhood that thinks your private property is their personal resort. The HOA even tried to fine me for keeping them out of my own pond. They wouldn't take no for an answer, so I came up with a solution that literally pulled the plug on their plans. I never thought owning a small piece of paradise would turn into such a headache, but that's exactly what happened when a new housing development popped up next to my family's old property. My parents bought this land decades ago, back when the area was mostly farms and empty fields. The property came with a natural spring-fed pond that covered about 2 acres. It wasn't huge, but it was beautiful. Crystal clear water surrounded by old oak trees and stocked with bass and bluegill that my dad had introduced years ago. Some of my best childhood memories involve sitting on the dock with him, fishing poles in hand, not talking much, but not needing to. When my parents passed, I inherited the property. By then I was in my 30s, working a job that let me telecommute most days. Moving back to the old house felt right. I renovated the place, updated the plumbing and electrical, but kept the character intact. The pond remained my favorite feature. I'd spend evenings out there, sometimes fishing, sometimes just sitting and watching the sunset reflect off the water. About 2 years after I moved back, things started changing. A developer purchased the massive tract of land on the east side of my property. Within months, construction crews were everywhere. They were building an upscale community called Riverside Estates, though there was no river anywhere nearby. The name was pure marketing. I watched with growing concern as dozens of cookie-cutter houses went up. Big, expensive homes with tiny yards all crammed together. The kind of place where people move because they want to live near nature without actually dealing with nature. The first residents moved in during the spring. I didn't think much of it until I started noticing people walking along the edge of my pond. At first it was just a couple here and there, joggers mostly, who had probably wandered off the development's walking trails. I didn't mind too much initially. The pond was visible from the road, and people have always been drawn to water, but then it became a regular thing. Families would show up on weekends with fishing poles. Kids would wade into the shallow areas. Someone even set up a small beach chair and umbrella on my shoreline like they were at a public beach. I put up some polite signs. Private property, no trespassing, and private pond, no fishing without permission. The signs helped for about a week. Then they started disappearing. I'd put up new ones and they'd vanish within days. One time I found one of my signs floating in the pond, torn in half. I mentioned it to one of the neighbors I ran into while checking my mailbox. He seemed surprised that the pond was private. He said he thought it was a community amenity that came with the neighborhood. I told him no, the pond and the land around it had been in my family for decades and had nothing to do with their development. He apologized and said he'd spread the word, but the trespassing continued. In fact, it got worse. That summer I came home from a grocery run to find about 15 people having what looked like a small party on my dock. They had a cooler, folding chairs, and a portable speaker playing music loud enough that I could hear it from my driveway, which was a good 100 yards away. I walked down there and asked them what they were doing. One guy, probably in his 40s, wearing an expensive polo shirt, looked at me like I was the one intruding. He told me they were residents of Riverside Estates, and they were just enjoying the community pond. I explained as calmly as I could that this wasn't a community pond. It was my private property. He laughed and said that couldn't be right because their real estate agent had specifically mentioned the pond as one of the neighborhood amenities. I told him their real estate agent was wrong and asked them to leave. Most of them looked embarrassed and started packing up, but the polo shirt guy got defensive. He said I couldn't just claim a pond that clearly served the whole community. I pulled out my phone and showed him the property survey I kept saved for exactly this kind of situation. The pond was clearly within my property lines. He finally left, but not before muttering something about talking to the homeowners association about this. That's when I learned that Riverside Estates had an HOA. A week later, I got a letter from them. It was addressed to me as a Riverside Estates resident, which I definitely was not. The letter welcomed me to the community and reminded me about various rules and regulations, including one about keeping community amenities accessible to all residents. I called the number on the letterhead and spoke to someone who identified herself as the HOA management company representative. I explained that I wasn't a resident of Riverside Estates and that my property, including the pond, had nothing to do with their development. She seemed confused and said she'd look into it. 2 weeks later, I got another letter. This one informed me that the HOA had reviewed the situation and determined that while my house might not be part of the development, the pond was clearly intended as a community resource. They cited something about historical use patterns and community expectations. The letter concluded by reminding me that restricting access to community amenities was against HOA rules and could result in fines. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I called my lawyer, someone I'd used for the estate stuff when my parents died. He looked over the letters and my property documents and basically told me the HOA had absolutely no authority over my property or my pond. He sent them a formal letter explaining this in legal terms. The HOA responded by sending me a fine. $500 for restricting community access to shared resources. I didn't pay it, obviously. My lawyer sent another letter, this one more strongly worded, explaining that any further harassment would result in legal action against the HOA. Things settled down for a few months. I thought maybe they'd finally gotten the message. I was wrong. The HOA held their annual meeting that fall, and apparently the pond situation was a major topic of discussion. I know this because 3 different residents came to my door afterward to complain. They'd been told by the HOA board that I was being unreasonable and that everyone had a right to use the pond. One woman actually said I was being selfish for keeping such a beautiful resource to myself. I asked her if she'd be okay with me setting up camp in her backyard anytime I wanted. She said that was completely different, though she couldn't explain how. The situation reached a breaking point when the HOA sent me a notice that they were going to put up a small dock and boat launch on the community pond, and that construction would begin the following month. They included a crude map showing where they planned to build, which was definitely on my property. My lawyer went into overdrive. He sent a cease and desist letter. He contacted the county to make sure they knew the pond was private property. He even reached out to the developer to confirm that the pond had never been part of the Riverside Estates project. The developer confirmed in writing that the pond was never included in their plans and that any claims otherwise were false. Apparently, some overzealous real estate agents had been using the proximity to the pond as a selling point without checking who actually owned it. The HOA backed down on the dock construction, but they didn't give up on claiming the pond as community property. Instead, they started a different approach. They sent me a letter stating that due to health and safety concerns, they would be conducting regular inspections of the pond to ensure it met community standards. I told them they could inspect it from the road with binoculars because they weren't setting foot on my property. That's when they sent their biggest fine yet. $2,000 for failure to maintain community amenities in accordance with HOA standards. By this point, I was beyond frustrated. I'd been dealing with this garbage for over a year. The constant trespassing, the entitled attitudes, the ridiculous letters and fines from an HOA I'd never joined and had no authority over me. My lawyer assured me we'd win any legal battle easily, but the HOA seemed content to just keep harassing me indefinitely. Then I had an idea. If the HOA was so insistent that this was community property that needed to be maintained to their standards, maybe I should take their concern about maintenance seriously, very seriously. The pond was spring-fed, but my dad had also installed a drainage system years ago when he built up the dam on one end. There was a large overflow pipe with a gate valve that could be opened to release water into a creek that ran through the back of the property. Technically, the pond could be drained if needed. Dad had designed it that way in case we ever needed to do maintenance or repairs on the dam. We'd never actually drained it completely, but the system was there and fully functional. I started researching pond maintenance and found plenty of legitimate reasons why someone might need to drain a pond. Sediment buildup, invasive plant species, structural repairs to the dam or shoreline, water quality issues, all perfectly valid reasons. I called a pond management company and had them come out for an inspection. I explained that I was concerned about sediment buildup and wanted a professional opinion. The guy who came out was thorough. He took water samples, measured depths in various spots, and checked the overall condition of the pond. His report noted some minor sediment accumulation that could potentially be addressed in the future, but nothing urgent. However, and this was the key part, he noted that a full drainage and cleaning would certainly improve the overall health and longevity of the pond. He mentioned it was something that many pond owners did every 10 or 15 years as part of regular maintenance. Perfect. About a week after getting the inspection report, I was driving past the main entrance to Riverside Estates when I noticed something that made me hit the brakes. There were bright-colored flyers posted on the community bulletin board near the entrance. I pulled over to take a closer look. The flyers were advertising a community fishing tournament at the pond. My pond. The date listed was about 3 weeks out on a Saturday. There was even a prize structure listed and mention of food trucks and family activities. They were planning a whole event on my property without asking permission. I took photos of the flyers and sent them to my lawyer. He was livid. This was beyond sending letters and making empty threats. They were actively planning to use my property for a large organized event. But for me, this was perfect timing. If the HOA was so insistent on using the pond and kept demanding it be maintained to community standards, I'd give them exactly what they wanted: a properly maintained pond. I'd just need to drain it completely first to do the job right. I contacted the pond management company and scheduled a full drainage, cleaning, and maintenance service. I picked the exact weekend of the fishing tournament. The guy I spoke to mentioned they'd need to relocate the fish temporarily, which was fine. They'd bring several large aerated holding tanks, basically a temporary filtration and aeration system that would keep the fish healthy until the pond was ready to be restocked. I confirmed everything with them twice. They'd arrive early Saturday morning, drain the pond, remove sediment, treat the exposed pond bed, and then let it refill naturally over the following weeks. It was legitimate, professional work that any responsible pond owner might do. I also called the county sheriff's office and gave them a heads up. I explained the situation and told them I was doing maintenance on my private pond and that I expected people might show up anyway for an unauthorized event. The deputy I spoke with made a note of it and said they'd have someone swing by if needed. The night before the work was scheduled to start, I put up new signs all around the pond, big professional ones that read "Private Property," "Pond Maintenance in Progress," "No Trespassing," "Violators will be prosecuted." I also put up some temporary construction fencing with similar signs attached. I didn't sleep much that night. Part of me felt guilty about what I was doing, but a bigger part of me was tired of being pushed around by people who thought they could just take whatever they wanted. The pond management crew showed up at 7 Saturday morning. Professional outfit, proper equipment, the works. By the time the sun was fully up, they had industrial pumps running and water was steadily flowing out of the pond through the old drainage system and into the creek. The water level started dropping immediately. I sat on my porch with coffee, watching the water level go down. Around 9 o'clock, cars started arriving. Lots of cars. The HOA had really promoted this tournament. Families with kids, serious anglers with expensive gear, even a couple of people with small boats on trailers hoping to launch them. They all parked along the road near my property and started walking toward the pond, carrying their fishing equipment in coolers. When they got close enough to see what was happening, I could see the confusion spread through the crowd. Some people stopped dead in their tracks, others kept walking like maybe they were seeing things wrong. The water level was already down about 4 feet and dropping steadily. The pumps were loud, and the exposed shoreline was muddy and littered with years of accumulated debris. One guy, red-faced and angry, marched up to where I was standing near the work crew. He had his phone out, recording. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing. I explained calmly that I was performing scheduled maintenance on my private pond. He said I couldn't do that because there was a community event scheduled. I told him I hadn't scheduled any event and nobody had asked my permission to use my property. He got even redder and said the HOA had every right to use the pond. I disagreed and suggested he might want to consult with a lawyer about property rights. He threatened to call the police. I told him to go ahead. I'd already given them a heads up about potential trespassers. More people gathered, probably 50 or 60 in total by mid-morning. Some were angry, others just seemed disappointed. Parents had to explain to confused kids why they couldn't fish in the disappearing pond. A few people understood immediately what had happened and actually laughed. One older guy came up to me privately and said he'd been saying from the beginning that the pond couldn't possibly be community property, and now he felt vindicated. The HOA board president showed up around 10:30. She was a woman in her 50s who always dressed like she was heading to a country club. She was less aggressive than some of the others, but equally insistent that I was in the wrong. She said I'd deliberately sabotaged their event. I pointed out that it was my pond, on my property, and I could do maintenance whenever I needed to. I also mentioned that they'd scheduled an event on private property without permission, which was pretty bold. She tried a different approach, her voice getting sugary sweet. She suggested we could work out some kind of arrangement where the community could use the pond in exchange for helping with maintenance costs. I told her I'd think about it, knowing full well I had no intention of agreeing to anything that gave the HOA any claim whatsoever to my property. She wasn't done, though. She pulled out her phone and started taking photos and videos of the drained pond, the equipment, everything. She was probably thinking she could use them against me somehow. I didn't care. Everything I was doing was completely legal and properly permitted. By noon, the pond was about 80% drained. It was just a muddy basin with some puddles here and there and the spring still trickling in at the far end. The fish were safely relocated to several large aerated holding tanks the pond management company had brought. For a 2-acre pond, they'd brought quite a setup, basically a temporary filtration and aeration system that would keep the fish healthy until the pond was ready to be restocked. The crowd had mostly dispersed by early afternoon, though a few people hung around to watch the work or to complain to me some more. One woman actually started crying, saying her kids had been so excited for the fishing tournament. I felt bad for the kids, but not bad enough to regret what I was doing. Their parents should have checked whether they actually had permission to use someone else's property. The work crew finished draining the pond and started the cleaning process. They were going to be there most of the weekend working on it. I paid them well, and they were thorough. The following Monday, I got an email from someone at the local newspaper's community section. Apparently, the HOA president had submitted a story to them trying to paint me as the villain who'd ruined a family-friendly community event. The reporter wanted to hear my side. I met with her that afternoon. I explained patiently that it wasn't a community pond, showed her my property documents, the survey, my deed, everything. I showed her the timeline of harassment from the HOA, the fines they'd tried to levy, their threat to build on my property. I showed her the photos of the flyers advertising an event on my private land without permission. The reporter was professional and took detailed notes. She asked if she could interview some of the HOA residents too, and I told her to go ahead. A few days later, she called me back with some interesting information. She'd talked to several residents who admitted they'd been told by their real estate agents that the pond was a community amenity. Some had even paid premium prices for lots that supposedly had pond access. But when she asked to see documentation of this, nobody could produce anything. The HOA had nothing in writing. The developer had nothing in writing. It had all been verbal promises and assumptions. The story ran in the following week's edition. It was pretty fair, actually. The reporter presented it as a case of miscommunication and unclear boundaries, but anyone reading between the lines could see that the HOA had massively overstepped. She even included quotes from a couple of residents who said they felt misled by the sales process. The article triggered something I hadn't expected. Several other residents started asking questions about what else they might have been misled about. The HOA held an emergency meeting, which I obviously wasn't invited to, but I heard about it from a couple of sympathetic neighbors. Apparently it got heated. People wanted to know why the board had been issuing fines and making threats about property the HOA didn't actually control. Some residents pointed out that this opened the HOA up to liability issues. Others were angry about being lied to during the home buying process. Within a week, I received a formal letter from the HOA. This one was very different in tone from all the previous letters. It was an apology. They acknowledged that they had been operating under incorrect information regarding the pond's ownership. They withdrew all previous fines and demands. They asked if we could discuss an arrangement for limited community access. I ignored the letter. My lawyer sent them a final communication stating that any future contact from the HOA regarding my property would be considered harassment and would result in legal action. We also demanded they send a notice to all residents clarifying that the pond was private property with no community access. They complied. Every household in Riverside Estates got a notice explaining that the pond adjacent to the development was private property and that trespassing would be prosecuted. The HOA also updated their official documents to remove any reference to the pond as a community amenity. About 2 months after the drainage incident, I got a letter from a law firm representing 3 families from Riverside Estates. They were suing their real estate agents and the developer for misrepresentation. Apparently, the pond access had been a major selling point for their home purchases, and they'd paid premium prices for lots that supposedly backed up to community waterfront property. They asked if I'd be willing to provide a statement confirming the pond was always private property. I was happy to help. My lawyer told me later that the lawsuits were settled out of court, with the families receiving substantial compensation. The real estate agents involved lost their licenses. The HOA's insurance company apparently wasn't happy about the whole situation either, trying to claim authority over property they didn't own, issuing fines they had no right to issue, and planning construction on someone else's land opened them up to significant liability. I heard their insurance premiums went up considerably, which meant higher HOA fees for everyone in Riverside Estates. The pond refilled over the next few weeks. The spring kept flowing, and gradually the water level came back up. The pond management company restocked the fish, and everything went back to normal. Better than normal, actually, because the water was clearer and healthier than it had been in years. I added some better signs and installed a couple of security cameras to discourage any future trespassing. There were a few incidents early on, people who either hadn't gotten the memo or chose to ignore it. But a couple of calls to the sheriff's department took care of that. After deputies showed up a few times and issued warnings, word spread pretty quickly. Some of the Riverside Estates residents still seemed bitter about the whole thing. I'd occasionally get dirty looks when I was out in my yard, but most people moved on. A few even stopped by to apologize for the trouble and asked if they could occasionally fish there with permission. I let a couple of the reasonable ones do so, but only after making it very clear that it was my property and access was a privilege I could revoke any time. The HOA board president resigned a few months later. I heard through the grapevine that she'd gotten a lot of heat from residents over the pond fiasco and some other questionable decisions she'd made. The new board was much less aggressive and seemed to have learned from their predecessors' mistakes. They actually sent me a polite letter introducing themselves and assuring me they had no intention of repeating the previous board's errors. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if there was a better way to handle the situation. Could I have been more patient or tried harder to educate people about property boundaries? Maybe. But honestly, after a year of being ignored, fined, and treated like I was the problem for wanting to control my own property, I don't regret what I did. The HOA had every opportunity to handle things properly. They could have checked property records before making claims about the pond. They could have respected the multiple letters from my lawyer. They could have canceled their fishing tournament when they realized it was on private property. Instead, they doubled down on their entitlement at every turn. What they got was a lesson in property rights and the consequences of making assumptions. They wanted a community pond maintained to their standards. Well, they got to watch me maintain it, just not in the way they expected. My pond is peaceful again. I still spend evenings out there, fishing or just sitting on the dock. The water is actually in better shape now than it's been in years, so the drainage ended up being legitimately beneficial. Sometimes I think about my dad and how he'd have handled the situation. He probably would have done exactly what I did, though he might have enjoyed the drama a bit more than I did. The property values in Riverside Estates apparently took a small hit after the whole controversy. Some potential buyers were put off by the HOA drama and the discovery that the community didn't actually include access to the nearby pond as some agents had advertised. I can't say I feel too bad about that. Maybe it'll teach developers and real estate agents to be more honest about what's actually included when they're selling properties. These days, when I see someone from the development out jogging or walking their dog, they give the pond a wide berth. The message finally sank in. The pond is mine. It always was and it always will be. And if anyone tries to claim otherwise again, well, it's been a couple of years since that drainage. Might be time for some more routine maintenance soon. The next one is a pro-revenge story. Was a fun morning at the beginning of last week, starting up my truck and waking everyone up at 2:45 a.m. to learn someone swiped the hollowed-out cats. The idiots missed the neighbors' cameras that basically gave away who they were. It's two kids from the area who drive around in a pretty busted-up police Crown Vic. I chose not to call the cops. Instead, I called one of my friends who's code enforcement and let him know what my plan was, and he relayed the info to the police that I was finally going to do a nuisance tow on that same Crown Victoria. The car they drive isn't street legal, as it has no license plates or insurance or working taillights and rattles like crap due to the trash sound system. They also spend their whole day at a chicken shack smoking. Not sure who they're getting money from, but I'm guessing stealing catalytics was part of the equation. When I spotted the car sitting on a quiet street, I called it in and got the go-ahead to tow. I took it straight to the police station and they tried to run a owner check with the VIN number, only to find out it hadn't been registered since 2011 and the owner was someone other than the kids who sold them the car with no title because of all the back registration owed. The cops said we can go ahead and take it to the junkyard till they can get a black title, aka certificate of destruction. By then, the two idiots were running around all over town looking for their car, thinking it got stolen by one of their friends as a prank. The key lock was so worn out you could start it with any car key. They found it at the junkyard and tried to steal it by one of them distracting the owner and the other stealing their car, but the junkyard was aware of who they were, so they cut the drive shaft off beforehand. I missed out on this part, but they got arrested for trying to steal their car back, and they watched as the junkyard used a crane to rip the car to shreds. When I saw it, the remains looked like a toddler just ripped it to the bare frame out of curiosity. They've been out of jail since, but haven't left their trailer. I did a drive-by earlier and noticed a beater Jeep Liberty in their driveway, also with no plates, and already working with the cops on taking that too if I see it out in the public, except I won't miss the show next time. The next one is a malicious compliance story. Background. Our ship would head offshore almost every week for training and deployment workups. We usually left Monday morning and returned Friday afternoon, although sometimes we remained at sea through the weekend. Much of what we did consisted of drills and practice exercises. We would shut down an engine and react to the loss. We would simulate a fire and respond to it. It was fairly basic training, and we could carry it out without any other ships around. For that reason, we operated in an area with limited commercial traffic. During some drills, we would go dead in the water, meaning we lost engine power. Without the engines, we also lost steering and sometimes electrical power. We occasionally covered windows to simulate smoke and reduced visibility. Obviously, you do not want to be close to land or other vessels while doing that. Even without propulsion, the ship would still move because of the wind, tides, and currents. We would be unpredictable and potentially hazardous to other traffic. That should give you the general setting. We usually stopped running drills by 10 o'clock p.m. or 2200 hours. From then until morning, we were simply steaming through the darkness with essentially nowhere to go. We did not drop anchor and sit in one place. We could not shut everything down and drift. Instead, we drove back and forth in a large racetrack pattern. We maintained the minimum speed necessary to reduce rolling and preserve steering control. The rudder needed roughly 3 knots, or about 5 miles per hour, to function effectively. We would patrol a large rectangular area, traveling toward one end, making a slow and gentle 180-degree turn, and heading back the other way. The turns were kept smooth so we did not wake the off-watch crew or send plates flying. Occasionally, we adjusted our course to compensate for currents, wind, and similar factors. Our daily night orders were usually very simple: stay inside the designated box. If we accidentally left the box, we had to notify the commanding officer. The area inside it was considered safe, but the space outside it could present problems. Going far outside, it could become newsworthy. Importantly, there were no instructions explaining how we had to remain inside the box. That detail matters. We also had permanent standing orders concerning nearby ships. If we detected another vessel whose closest point of approach, or CPA, would be 6 nautical miles or less, we had to notify the captain before that vessel came within 10 nautical miles. We also had to recommend a course or speed adjustment that would keep the other ship outside the 6-mile limit. The captain could approve our recommendation or reject it and say something like, 5.5 nautical miles is acceptable, but notify me again if it comes closer than 5. This could happen even when the other vessel was safely passing behind us, and all we would need to do was increase speed unnecessarily. Sailors can start here. At night, we tried to avoid waking the captain unless it was necessary. Think of it like calling the owner of a company in the middle of the night over something you could easily handle yourself. If another ship was projected to pass too closely while we were operating inside the box, we would see whether we could safely turn and avoid the problem before the notification requirement was triggered. That allowed us to follow both sets of orders. Turning while remaining inside the box complied with the night orders. Altering course early enough to keep the vessel outside the 6 nautical mile closest point of approach before it crossed within 10 nautical miles meant we did not have to wake the captain under the standing orders. Every officer of the deck did this. We all believed it was a reasonable use of the discretion we had been given. We had not been ordered to follow a racetrack pattern or any other specific route. We had only been told to remain inside the box and turn before leaving it. Apparently, the old man did not agree. One night, the commanding officer must have visited the bridge and seen us make one of those early turns. He was not happy when he discovered that this was our standard practice. From our perspective, we were doing him a favor. It did not even feel like malicious compliance because we genuinely believed we were interpreting the orders correctly. We had been given discretion to maneuver however we wanted inside the box. The captain apparently viewed it differently. Since the presence of another ship influenced our decision to turn, he believed we should have called him, even though the turn itself was already allowed under the night orders. So the commanding officer forced us into malicious compliance. He changed the orders. From that point forward, if we made any course or speed adjustment because of shipping, rather than solely because we had reached the edge of the box, we had to call him. I think he assumed we did not encounter much traffic at night. He was wrong. The captain began receiving multiple calls every night after already spending long days overseeing drills. Before this change, he was the person receiving the most sleep because he did not stand a regular night watch. Afterward, he was probably receiving the least. I cannot remember whether he changed the orders back by the end of the following week or the week after that. Even he, an enormous micromanager, eventually realized how absurd it was to receive calls at 2 o'clock in the morning like this. Captain, we are 5 minutes from our scheduled turn at the edge of the box. We currently have a vessel 12 nautical miles away on our bow, with a predicted closest point of approach of 6 nautical miles. In accordance with your orders, we recommend maintaining our present plan and turning in approximately 4 minutes. After the turn, we estimate the new closest point of approach will be 9 nautical miles off our stern. Under the old interpretation, we could simply have turned 5 minutes earlier and never called him. The same thing could happen in the middle of the box. We could see a ship approaching, make a harmless early turn, and eliminate the problem entirely. But he demanded to be notified whenever shipping influenced our decisions, so we notified him every single time. Anyway, thank you for watching.